Thank you very much for being here tonight. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about these, I think, important issues. Probably a lot of people think are very boring issues, but actually, beside and beyond the technicalities of that, really is what we economists tend to wrap up everything we do wrongly, I think. Money is an important part of our work. So I think understanding how money works and also the link between money and power is very important. And to put my cards on the table, I'm finishing a book on the renminbi, or the people's money. In fact, the title of the book is The People's Money, which I'm frantically put together because I have to submit it to my publisher by the end of next month. And as you can see, Colin, it's quite a daunting task. But anyway, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for tonight because I decided that there wasn't anything interesting enough except a lot of numbers, and I don't want to bore you with a lot of numbers. I would prefer to bore you with a lot of words. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I got notes, so I will go through, and I have to sustain quite long time and try to develop my argument. So I normally go to conferences and events where we are allowed to speak only for 5 minutes or maybe 10 minutes. And then again, when you go on television, then you have a sound bites of 30 seconds where you have to put everything into really just almost 2 words, and even shorter than Twitter. So it is a great privilege to be here and to be able to elaborate a bit more on these themes. And so preparing these lectures has offered me a great opportunity to sit and think and put on paper here a few thoughts. So again, all people have to wear glasses, otherwise they cannot read what they wrote. So I think now we're ready to go. And the point I'm making, the title of this lecture is All Change, the World of New International Currencies. So the point I'm making is that money is power. So it's not only a means of exchange or a store of value. And so these lectures tell the story how the international monetary system is changing as a result of the change in the world and geopolitical, geoeconomic changes. And also how the world of currencies epitomizes a fundamental shift in power and influence towards nation-states others than the United States. And in fact, we see particularly the emergence of China, but also the other BRICS. And we heard recently about this plan to set up a BRICS bank. But it is not only a world of nations, but also away from the very concept of nation-state. In 1993, Nobel laureate Robert Mundell wrote that great nations have great currencies. This was an appropriate, concise way to describe the world of currencies in the late 20th century. In those days, indeed, the most important currencies were issued by countries of strategic and geopolitical relevance, with well-functioning and relatively open market economies. For a long time, primacy in monetary affairs has been associated with the sovereign state. Monetary power has been seen to emanate from and to be the expression of the nation-state as the basic unit of world politics. Since the strengthening of nation-states in the 19th century, national monetary sovereignty has become an integral part of the global governance structure, and currency embodies separate jurisdictions that overlap with sovereign jurisdictions. Each state, even the most insignificant state, issues and maintains its own exclusive territorial currency. But does the concept of great nations have great currencies still apply to today's globalized world, where, to quote Benjamin Cohen, money has been increasingly deterritorialized? Surely currencies are symbols of the country's power, and they are a proxy for their role in the world. Therefore, we talk about great nations have great currencies. And this particular concept resonates well with the Chinese leadership in its quest to expand the international use of the renminbi and to reduce the country's dependence on the dollar. If we accept then the notion that a currency is a distinct feature of the countries that issue it, then where does the euro stand here? Great nations have great currencies. It's clearly inappropriate to describe the euro, which is the world's second most important currency in terms of use in trade, in the payment system, and in asset accumulation. Being the currency that is partly issued by the member states of Europe's Economic and Monetary Union, with a common monetary policy central bank, but with national fiscal policies, the euro is a stateless currency. And then what about virtual and stateless cryptocurrencies, such as the Bitcoin, that are not even issued by a central bank, but are minted by computer algorithms? In my lecture this evening, I argue that the world of currencies, or the international monetary system, is changing to reflect a transformation in the world economic order. In a multipolar world economy, where the relative weight of the United States has been reduced, while that of China and other developing countries or emerging market economies has increased, the dollar will be less dominant. The growing international use of China's renminbi is an indication of this trend and complements the rise of China as an international power. To some extent, China needs a great currency in order to be fully recognized as a great nation. In this sense, primacy in monetary affairs continues to be associated with the sovereign state, and monetary power continues to emanate from and to be the expression of the nation-state as a basic unit, as I said, of world politics. At the same time, however, the transformation of the international monetary system includes the emergence of currencies that are delinked from the sovereign state. So the appearance of the euro reflects the separation of stately currencies, reflects the separation in the age of globalization between global markets and nation-states, and suggests then the concept of monetary power, or currency power, no longer perfectly overlaps with the concept of national monetary sovereignty. As I said before, money has become deterritorialized. So in a nutshell, national monetary sovereignty remains the dominant concept, shown in the case of large and influential countries like the United States or China. At the same time, however, there seems to be more and more scope for monetary sovereignty à la carte, or not sovereignty at all. The world we are in has been defined by the US dollar. It is a dollar-dominated world order. The dollar is the currency that dominates both international commerce and finance. It is the medium of exchange and the main vehicle currency that many individuals and businesses hold because of its convenience of use. The majority of international trade is invoiced and settled in dollar. The dollar is also used to invoice almost the totality of the United States export and import. Contrast this with the euro. Only half of the exports from countries in the euro area, so it's a very, very large area. Actually, in terms of size, GDP share, the European Union is a larger market than the United States. But even so, the exports inside Europe are just 40%, only half of the export, and 40% of imports are invoiced in euros. Many foreign firms use dollars not only for their trade with the United States, but with many other countries. For example, more than 80% of the exports of respectively South Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand are invoiced in dollars, while the United States accounts for at most 20% of trade of these countries' exports. So that means, again, the dollar in this case is used as a vehicle for these countries to trade with other countries in the world. So South Korea and India, they use dollars as a vehicle in their trade. In addition, the dollar is the dominant currency to price and settle trade in energy and commodities. Companies and industry that heavily depend on the imports of energy and commodities and trade in specialized markets prefer to use the dollar for their international exchanges because of low transaction cost and the availability of liquidity. And these are two important concepts that underpin the use of the dollar. So one is network externality. So if many people or many companies use a system, it could be, again, the dollars, or it could be another kind of network or system, then there are more people who are inclined to use this system because, again, there are less costs to be part of this network. And then the other is the concept of liquidity. So a currency, an international currency, need to be liquid. So in other words, people, firms, countries need to be able to convert, to exchange this currency at any time. They need to know then any time they want to exchange this currency or with something else, they are able to exchange the currency. So that means the currency is liquid. So the dollar has these features, both of being part of this large network, so network externalities, and liquid. It's a very liquid currency. The dollar, therefore, is also the currency that central banks around the world mostly hold in their reserves, and non-Americans hold to preserve the value of their wealth. And it is the key intervention currency and the currency to which many countries in the developing world anchor the value of their own currencies. Because of all these functions, the dollar glues the world economy together. Supplying the world's key currency presents many advantages for the issuing country. Debt can be denominated in that country's own currency and can be repaid in the same currency with no risk of currency mismatches. Domestic firms doing business abroad do not need to hedge themselves in order to manage a currency risk and reduce any substantial loss. Their revenues are in the same currency as their costs. And the country can spend considerably more than what it earns as long as foreigners are prepared to lend it and buy its debt. This has been the story of the United States since the end of World War II. And the story of its exorbitant privilege, as Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once described it. He was the finance minister of France and then he became the president in the 1960s. General de Gaulle, in turn, complained around the same time that the system allowed the United States to be in debt to foreign countries free of charge. Even so, for all these years, and despite of this exorbitant privilege, the dollar standard in trade, banking and finance has underpinned the United States' hegemony in foreign policy and defense. The link is very clear. Issuing the key, the reserve currency, means that the debt, in principle, the country can continue to be in debt as long as people, foreigners, are prepared to underpin this debt. Trusting a currency means implicitly trusting the institutions, the legal system, the economy, the business environment, and the policy of the country that issues that currency. We are in a system of fiat money. That means money issued by government decree. This means that, for example, notes issued by the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England are backed by the promise of government-guaranteed assets, and they are not exchangeable for any physical asset such as gold. Ultimately, fiat money is supported by confidence in the state's willingness and ability to use future taxation to meet all its obligations. In other words, printing money should reflect the capacity of a government to raise revenues through taxation. A government's credibility to maintain the value of fiat money is essential to preserve market confidence. Market forces, in turn, are critical to determine a currency's stability and strength. Governments of countries that issue the leading currencies have to play the confidence game, as Paul Krugman calls it. Inflation and market instability can lead to capital losses on holders of those currencies, and this in turn can affect market demand. Unlike the Bretton Woods system, where the dollar was, at least in principle, convertible into a given amount of gold, and the rich countries, the developed countries, especially in Western Europe, pegged their currencies to the dollar, these days the United States is under no obligation to maintain the value of the dollar or to supply liquidity on demand. To paraphrase John Connolly, the US Secretary of State under Nixon, The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. So in other words, you keep the dollar in your wallet at your peril. So you have to trust the United States government to implement the right policy. And the rest of the markets, and you also need to think in terms of the rest of the markets to believe that the confidence game will continue. However, for more than 14 years, since the end of the dollar's gold convertibility, non-Americans have trusted the U.S. monetary authorities to keep the currency's value and promptly meet the international demand for liquidity. But loss of confidence and trust can trigger runs on banks and speculation, and this can endanger the stability of the financial system. For example, when in 1931 sterling, and that was followed by the dollar and the other main currencies, abandoned the gold standard and became a fiat money, market pressures were too strong to be contained, and governments further reacted by introducing restriction on trade and foreign exchange operations. This marked the collapse of the international economic and trade system. So in other words, in order to avoid an outflow of capital, controls had to be introduced. And obviously that was, once controls were introduced and barriers, obviously that marked the end of the international economic and trade system. There is, however, an unresolved contradiction between the goal of maintaining the value of the key reserve currency and that of ensuring liquidity to the world economy. And this contradiction or dilemma is called Thrifting Dilemma, and it came up in the early 1960s when the United States, that was part of the Bretton Woods system, but the United States were actually struggling to maintain this liquidity, so that means they were printing money, and obviously again, printing money means more debt, and therefore eroding the confidence of other players in this game. In order to provide the necessary liquidity, the country that issues the key reserve currency may end up running a deficit in its current account. Persistent current account deficits undermine the goal of maintaining confidence and trust in the key reserve currency. As current account deficits widen in response to demands for liquidity, confidence begins to erode. At this point, other countries have the option of taking on the burden of adjustment, that is, accepting some degree of appreciation of their currencies, or switching to other reserve assets. However, in one reserve currency system, which is more or less the one we are in, but it was definitely this is the system in the Bretton Woods years, the switching to other reserve currency is not an option. If other countries are not prepared to appreciate their currencies, then the current account deficit of the key reserve currency continues to widen until the confidence of the holders of the key currency continues to sink. And we know this the end of the Bretton Woods system, where the United States decided to stop this system unilaterally in 1971. So the dollar is much more than the key reserve currency and the key vehicle. It is also the expression of the US geopolitical hegemony. Many people around the world, especially in the developing countries, trust the dollar as a store of value and a safe haven, especially in times of crisis. But they also hate the dollar because it is the expression of the American power. This ambiguity has been conveyed to me several times around the world, and in particular in Asia. Let's take the example of oil prices. Oil prices are almost exclusively quoted in dollars, and this has been the case since the first drilling in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. In February 1971, an oil agreement was negotiated and signed between the United States and Saudi Arabia to ensure that the Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, price its oil export in US dollars. Similarly, oil importing countries across the world are required to pay dollars for the imports of oil from OPEC members. Contracts for commodities such as gold, silver, aluminium, corn, or wheat are also denominated in dollars. But this is more than just commercial links. Money is power, and holding dollars or having the ability to undermine the US influence encapsulates such power. For instance, the threat of stopping to price oil in dollars and switch to the euro is often waived as a retaliation measures by some oil-producing countries, but then they have oil-producing countries that have tense bilateral relations with the United States, and these are in particular Iran and Venezuela. That was also the case of the Iraq government led when it was led by Saddam Hussein. So, for example, in October 2000, the Iraqi government demanded to settle its petroleum exports in euros under the Oil for Food program managed by the United Nations. Since 2005, Iran and Venezuela have been trying to switch to the euro, even if all other OPEC member countries still trade in dollars. In February 2006, Iran declared and it was considering to establish an Iranian oil bourse with the goal of competing with the New York Mercantile Exchange and London's International Petroleum Exchange. Later, in December 2007, Iran stopped accepting dollars for its oil, and the oil bourse was officially opened in February 2008. A month later, the Venezuelan government opted to sign some of the oil contracts in euros rather than in dollars because of the decline of the value of the greenback against the euro. In the same year, during an OPEC meeting, Venezuela backed the Iranian proposal for OPEC to abandon the dollar and use the euro as the basis for oil pricing. But OPEC rejected the idea at that time, partly because a lot of OPEC members are allies of the United States. So this is something which, again, where you can see commercial reasons and economic reasons overlapping with geopolitical issues. In January 2012, it was India's turn to talk about replacing the dollar in oil prices. And in particularly, India was actually siding with Tehran to discuss alternative payment method in the wake of US sanctions against Iranian oil. We can continue with this example, but this actually is a very simplistic and not to say naive approach to power and money. Thinking that the power of the United States can be dented by pricing oil in euros or by holding foreign exchange reserves in euro is actually a very narrow approach and a very narrow way of referring to a highly complex system of rules that underpins the US leadership. In other words, the dollar is the tip of the iceberg of a very complex system of rules and governance, which actually has the United States as its main reference and sponsor. And this system also is somehow epitomized by the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were created at the time of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 when the dollar system was created. But what does it make an international currency? Let's look at the sterling, which was the international currency before the dollar. And looking at the sterling will also give us an insight on how a currency became international and a leading currency, but also how a currency declines. So the link between a nation's economic development and its international standing has always been reflected in the world of currencies. Before the dollar, the pound sterling was the world key currency. And Britain was the first industrial nation, a powerful empire, and an international center for trade and finance. In the late 19th century, at the helm of the British Empire, Great Britain was the world's largest economy that accounted for about 8% of the total GDP. And it was the dominant country in international trade. Again, international trade is the important ingredient for making a currency international, because the currency is used for trading, and obviously a large trading nation can impose its own currency in settling trade. Factories in Manchester, Sheffield, and in the large industrialized north needed commodities such as oil, iron, coal, and copper, and semi-manufactured goods to build engines, steamships, locomotives, and railways. The increasingly prosperous and expanding middle class were keen consumers of sugar, tea, coffee, spices, silver, and silk. Between 1816 and 1914, Britain absorbed more than 20% of export from the rest of the world. Most of this trade was handled by the City of London, that throughout the 19th century was a trading centre even more than a financial centre. This helped the development of banking and financial activities, with sterling as the key currency within the system of international payments. Until the outbreak of World War I, when its convertibility was suspended, the pound sterling bestrode the financial world like a colossus, again to quote Benjamin Cohen. The sterling kept Great Britain at the center of the world economy and finance, even if the British economy had been overtaken by the United States in terms of total national income by 1870, and then in terms of international power by 1880, and then by Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. But it took almost 60 years from 1870 for a serious challenge to the key status of sterling to arise, mainly from the dollar. After World War II, in 1947, sterling still accounted for about 87% of global foreign exchange reserves. It took another 10 years and a 30% depreciation before the share of dollar reserves exceeded that of sterling. In the 1950s, the sterling area, which was 35 countries and colonies that pegged their currency to sterling and held primarily a sterling reserve. So the sterling area accounted for half of the world trade, and sterling accounted for over half of the world's foreign exchange reserves. It took another decade and several unilateral measures because the British government was desperate to reduce the status of the role of the pound, because obviously they wanted to reduce the strength of the pound despite all this depreciation. So the government really embedded many unilateral measures to encourage the use of the dollar and the establishment of the offshore euro-dollar market. So finally, the sterling decline as a commercial currency and a reserve as a reserve currency. These days, the sterling has about 5% shares of the total reserves, at least the one we know, and the euro has almost 30%, and the dollar is about 67, 68. As Catherine Schenck argues in The Decline of Sterling, rising international liquidity, inflation, geographical redistribution, and international cooperation were the cornerstones that eased the retreat of sterling from global to national status. If there is a lesson from sterling's long decline, is that inertia and habits make people and organizations reluctant to change, and this has made the dollar's monetary hegemony particularly resilient. Things, however, have begun to change, and the global financial crisis has dented many people's confidence in the abilities of the United States to preserve the value of the dollar. Since the outburst of the crisis in 2008, the US has implemented policies in support of the domestic economy that has generated spillovers on the rest of the world and have also weakened the currency. In fact, the dollar has been on a sort of declining trend in trade weighted terms since 2008, with the lowest point in July 2011. And then in 2011, again, there was the downgrade of US debt from AAA down to AA+ by the rating agency Standard & Poor's. And this came as a shock to the world, even more than to the United States themselves. And it was considered as a declaration of low confidence in the solvency of the world's most influential country. The Federal Reserve played down the news so to prevent an adverse market reaction, but turned to the banking system to avoid any negative impact from the downgrade. Yet the rest of the world, especially China, urged the United States to seriously address its structural debt problem. The potential fragility and intrinsic systemic risks of the current international monetary system that is too dependent on the dollar had been highlighted a few years earlier, in 2009, by Zhou Xiaochuan, the governor of the People's Bank of China, China's central bank. The country that issues the key reserve currency, said Governor Zhou, often faces the dilemma of how to reconcile domestic monetary goals with meeting the international demand for the currency. When domestic monetary goals conflict with the need to maintain the value of the currency, then there might be increasing costs and risk in using and holding that currency for international transaction investment. Therefore, Governor Joe suggested that the international monetary system should be based on a supranational currency rather than on a national currency like the dollar. And this supranational currency could be used as an international reserve currency. This currency will be, to quote Governor Joe, disconnected from economic conditions and sovereign interests of any single country. And this words sprang a debate on the new on the reform of the international monetary system, and this debate was very much supported by China and France, but actually didn't really deliver anything, because in the end it's very difficult to create this supranational currency or global currency. So therefore China moved towards another solution. Why China? Because among emerging and developing countries, China is the one that feels more intensely the constraint that arise from not having an international currency. Remember, great countries have great currencies, and therefore from being overexposed to the dollar. China is now the world's biggest exporter and the second largest economy, with just over 10% of the global GDP. It is ahead of Japan, the economy of which now weighs for approximately 80% of global GDP. The United States, the world's largest economy, counts for just over 20% of the world's economy's total size. So China is the second largest economy, but doesn't have a currency that reflects its role, at least its economic role, in the world. The renminbi is a currency with limited circulation outside China and limited liquidity. Chinese companies, therefore, face transaction costs and exchange rate risk in using dollars in international trade. And there are costs associated with large dollar holdings. You're probably aware that now China holds in its official reserve more than $4 trillion. This is the wealth of the nation, and the Chinese authorities are concerned about potential losses from the appreciation of the exchange rate. So they have already got some losses since the decline of the value of the dollar. In fact, the Bank of the International Settlement in Basel, this is the central bank of the central banks, calculated and made a calculation actually some time ago, so in December 2010, when China had only $2.7 trillion. So they made a calculation, and in case of 10% appreciation of the renminbi, China losses will be the equivalent of 4.6% of its GDP, so it's really considerable losses. Now the reserve have increased even more, so the losses will be even bigger. And not only there are losses on holding dollars, there is also an opportunity cost in holding dollars. That means then opportunity cost is when you invest in one asset instead of investing in an asset with less return, less profitable, instead of investing in more profitable assets. So China invests in dollar assets, in particular in bonds issued by the American government. And these are they have lower returns than the equivalent bonds issued by domestic bonds. So for example, now we know because of the global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has effectively on what we call zero interest rate almost, and just above zero, and therefore the interest rate, for example, on 1 year US Treasury bill is almost zero return. It's an almost zero return investment with a 1% yield. The same bond in China, issued by the PBOC, has a 4% yield. So again, China is particularly exposed and particularly lost on this kind of investment. And this is particularly problematic from a policy point of view, because it is effectively a subsidy to the United States. So we have the absolutely bizarre situation and strange situation where we have a developing country or a poor country like the Chinese like to see themselves, because they still have a significant number of people who lives below the poverty line, the $1.5 per day, and we have this poor country, developing country, that subsidize a rich country, and this really is not quite right. And again, the Chinese authorities understood this game, for a long time, and it suited somehow the development and growth model of China. But now it's over, and it cannot be pushed any further. So in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when the banking crisis in the United States resulted in the dearth of liquidity in dollars, China's dependence on the dollar, and especially in trade, became even more evident. And really there was, after when the banking crisis in the United States collapsed, the banking system really got under these severe pressures after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, then the liquidity really was somehow reduced, considerably reduced. So countries which use the dollars to trade found themselves without liquidity. And so again, that was another problem in China's experience, and which opened somehow the eyes on the over-dependence on the dollar. So the Chinese leadership has acknowledged in many occasions the need to reduce the pace of dollar accumulation. In 2009, the former Premier Wen Jiabao expressed his worries about the safety, literally the safety of China's holdings of US debt. A big and significant transformation is now underway. In 2009, the Chinese monetary authorities embarked on a strategy to develop the international use of the renminbi and eventually win their country off the dollar. If China succeeds in this strategy, a significant chunk of Asia's regional trade will be invoiced and settled in renminbi rather than in dollars. Not only that, but there will be less accumulation of dollars in China's official reserves, and even more crucially, less demand for T-bills from China. So the question is, how will the United States cope with this? Obviously, they are already putting together some strategies to become less dependent on external support, and how will a strong renminbi transform the power dynamics in Asia and in the world. As the international role of the United States is changing to reflect the fact that other nations, not necessarily in the US orbit of geopolitical influence, are coming to the fore, so the role of the dollar is changing as a result of the shifts towards a multi-currency international monetary system. Many have started to look beyond the dollar. So will the system of international money evolve to reflect the shift in the balance of economic power and to account for the emergence of large and fast-developing economies such as that of China? More options are now available than just a few years ago, and all these options compete with the dollars as international means of payment and store of value. These options stretch from emerging nations' currency, in particular the Chinese renminbi, to supranational currencies like the euro or cryptocurrencies like the Bitcoin. Each of these currencies has a well-defined role. The renminbi helps China to fully affirm its role in the world and in the region. The euro provides the monetary framework for Europe's single market. And the Bitcoin offers a stateless currency to those who do not believe in monetary sovereignty. Our monetary future looks more fragmented, but with more choices. None of the available options is strong enough to become the dominant one. Together, however, they can break the de facto monopoly enjoyed by the dollar as the global currency. Depending on our preferences, ideological stance, business needs, and expectations on the future value of each currency, we will be able to choose, or we are able already, to choose among a range of currencies. At the same time, we are able to use local currency, such, for example, the Bristol pound. You have an example not far from here. And those who think that the dollar will remain the ultimate safe haven will continue to back the greenback. The emergence of China's currency poses many policy challenges, in particular to financial and monetary stabilities. On many occasions, China's authorities have indicated that they are not in a hurry to push the renminbi, not least because this implies the huge task of reforming the domestic financial sector. So that means reforming the financial sector in order to liberalize capital flows and have a fully liquid currency. Therefore, they will keep the foot on the brake, but expect some further steps forward in the next years. In particular, watch for the possible inclusion of the renminbi in the SDR basket next year. The SDR is this currency invested, well, it's not even a currency. is the system that the IMF used to rebalance the monetary system. That's in a simple way. One thing, however, seems clear. China's leadership is not inclined to create a rival to the dollar. In their view, the emergence of the renminbi as an international currency will provide more options and make the international monetary system less dependent on the dollar and therefore less vulnerable to liquidity crises. Somehow they also feel the responsibility of having the dominant currency. So they prefer something which is more fragmented and possibly more resilient. Not only the reemergence of China as a powerful nation will eventually challenge the dollar's monetary hegemony. The very concept of monetary sovereignty has been fundamentally transformed in the past 20 years, along with economic integration or globalization, and in particularly because, and along also, with a huge policy experimentation in building a single market and a single currency in Europe. But the concept of national monetary sovereignty remains robust and resilient to challenges. It is not only the natural complement to national political sovereignty, but offers some considerable advantages that countries are not willing to give up. These advantages come from the ability to finance public spending through money creation, that is an instrument available to issuers of the currencies that are usually widely used as a reserve currency, to the power to manage monetary conditions. And big countries with important currencies tend to resist constraints from the international community to change or mitigate some of their policies. That was the case for the United States at the time of, right now with QE, but also has been the case with Japan, and it possibly the case as well for China. To conclude, with all these faults, the other thing is, we have there's been this change, and in particularly, I think the interesting experiment here in the world of currency is the euro, and I'd like to conclude with just spending a few words on the euro. The euro has, with all these faults and all these problems, especially institutional design, the euro has contributed to redefine the concept of monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty as the ability to issue its own currency has been one of the defining features of the Westphalian state system. The euro has shown the trade-off between monetary sovereignty and macroeconomic stability, or at least in principle. The recent case put forward by the Scottish National Party on Scotland's independence indicated that the ability of issuing own currency no longer or not strictly defines national identity and so sovereignty. At the same time, the loss of monetary independence as a consequence of joining Europe's monetary union was not seen to impinge on the country's, on Scotland's competitiveness. Within the context of the global marketplace and the variable geometry of regional arrangements, sovereignty has become a multi-tier concept, both vertically, so defined by the different levels of government, from local to regional to global, and horizontally, so in this case delineated through, for example, the membership of multilateral organizations and forums such as the G20. The EU integration model remains particularly attractive for small countries, even if it comes at the price of some concession on sovereignty. Global markets have come to replace the Westphalian system of territorial demarcation in today's world order. And this is very important for small countries. So the more small countries need an umbrella, the big countries retain the concept of sovereignty and obviously monetary sovereignty. And there is a very clear divide. And you can see, as I said, again, very clearly in the debate on the Scottish referendum, very clearly in the debate around the euro. With all these faults, small countries tend to feel they need to have this umbrella. But obviously this is something which is much more difficult to accept for big countries for which big nations still have, great nations still have great currencies. So to conclude, money will continue to evolve to reflect the evolving world order and the changing dynamics of the global economic order. And it will also continue to reflect changes in the way we transact. As the world has become more globalized, money no longer needs to be physically moved around. Information can be sent instead. But the question of how to define and maintain value for fiat money will continue to dominate the policy debate for years to come. Ultimately, it all depends on how people answer the question, who do I trust? Do people trust currency issuing governments and central bank, or do they trust a decentralized stateless system? Going forward, fragmentation and choice will allow each of us to reply to the question of trust in different ways. Thank you.